How do you analyze government searches and seizures under the Fourth Amendment on a criminal procedure essay? Well, step one, what does the Fourth Amendment tell us? The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable government searches and seizures. And for our purposes on a criminal procedure essay, we can really break this into two different categories. Number one, we have evidentiary searches and seizures, where law enforcement officers are going out to obtain evidence to use against a defendant in a criminal prosecution. And we have seizures of persons, seizures of people like you and me, right? And in today's video, we want to focus on this idea of government seizures of a person. Evidentiary searches and seizures we'll get to in our next video, but for right now, let's just focus on this idea when the government seizes a human being, right? Because that's going to be covered under the Fourth Amendment. Often people just think about searches and seizures of drugs and weapons, right? Fourth Amendment covers seizures of people, like you and me, right? So how do we determine if the government is seizing a person? It's a really easy test, right? Anytime on a criminal procedure essay that you have a law enforcement officer of any type stopping another individual, some sort of civilian or citizen, whether it's in the car, on the street, whether it's for a long period of time or a very brief period of time, you should immediately begin asking the question, is this a government seizure of a person? And remember, it has to be carried out by the government. If we have one private person doing this to another private person, if I'm stopping you on the side of the street, I'm not a law enforcement officer. I'm not a government official. That doesn't trigger the Fourth Amendment. It could trigger other stuff, right? Battery, assault, false imprisonment, depending on what I'm doing, but it's not going to trigger a seizure by the government under the Fourth Amendment, right? So again, if we have a law enforcement officer stopping a private citizen for any reason, we want to ask the question, well, is this a seizure of a person being committed by the government? How do we do that? So if we have an encounter between a law enforcement officer and a citizen, we have to ask the question, would a reasonable person in that citizen's position have felt free to terminate that encounter under the totality of the circumstances? So it's a totality of the circumstances analysis. It's an objective test, and what we're asking is, sometimes I call this the were you free to walk away test. Would a reasonable person have felt free to walk away? Would a reasonable person have felt free to terminate this encounter, right? So if a police officer comes up to you on the side of the street and asks how your day's going, a police officer comes up to you and says, hey sir, how's your day going? Is that a seizure under the Fourth Amendment? No, right? A reasonable person would feel free to terminate that encounter. You could just say, my day's going great, and walk away, right? A reasonable person would not feel that they were not able to terminate that encounter. But imagine a situation we've probably all been in at one time or another. You're driving in your car and you see a squad car, a police officer pull up behind you and flip on their sirens, right? Well, at that point in time, would a reasonable person feel free to terminate that encounter? No, right? A reasonable person understands when a police officer comes behind you and flips on the lights, it means pull over, stop the car, we need to talk about this, right? You're not going to be able to just carry on driving and mind your own business. Oh, I'm free to terminate this encounter and keep driving, right? Bad things are going to happen if you do that. So we've probably all been seized by the government at one point or another. If you've ever been pulled over, even for a minor traffic violation, that's going to be a seizure, as long as a reasonable person would have not felt free to terminate the encounter. So if we have a seizure of a person being performed by the government, remember, under the Fourth Amendment, you're protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. So we have to ask the question, is this seizure of a person reasonable or unreasonable? So how do we do that? Well, question number one, if we determine that we have a government seizure of a person, is going to be, is this a Terry stop or is this an arrest? And it has to be one or the other. A Terry stop is an investigative stop that's based on a reasonable suspicion, right? If a police officer sees something going on and he has a reasonable suspicion that some sort of criminal activity might be going on, he can stop somebody to investigate the situation, right? He can stop them, but he has to take a diligent and reasonable approach to either confirm his suspicion or dispel his his suspicion, right? So under a Terry stop, it's going to be a much more, typically a briefer encounter. It's much more diligent. It's just to investigate the situation. An arrest is going to be based on probable cause, right? And an arrest is when a police officer is actually taking a person into police custody for an interrogation or criminal prosecution. This is obviously when you get the handcuffs slapped on you, you get taken down to the station for booking, and you're either subject to interrogation or criminal prosecution. That is an actual arrest. A Terry stop, again, is just stopping someone temporarily to investigate a situation. All right, so remember, once you identify, is this a Terry stop or is this an arrest? Do we have a police officer taking somebody into custody and arresting them, or is this police officer just investigating the situation? Okay, if we have a Terry stop, your next question is going to be, did the law enforcement officer have a reasonable suspicion? A law enforcement officer can't just seize a person walking down the street for any reason or no reason at all, right? At minimum, it has to be based on a reasonable suspicion in order to have a Terry stop to investigate a situation. Okay, so what is a reasonable suspicion? Typically, we say that a reasonable suspicion is more than a hunch. It has to be based on articulable facts. You have to be able to point to facts that you can articulate and say, that's why I had a reasonable suspicion. That guy was walking back and forth in front of the store. He looked nervous, looked like he's casing the joint, right? You can point to articulable facts. The police officer can't just say, I had a feeling, I had a gut feeling, or I had a hunch, right? So in this spectrum I have drawn here from 0% to 100%, you can think of this as degrees of certainty that some sort of criminal activity is afoot, right? And so at 0%, remember, a police officer can obviously do nothing. And even if he has what we call a hunch, right? A hunch is not going to be enough to seize a person, right? You can't perform a Terry stop to investigate somebody based on a hunch. At minimum, you have to have this idea of a reasonable suspicion that's based on articulable facts, right? And so if you have a Terry stop and it's based on a reasonable suspicion, right, that's a lawful stop. That's a reasonable seizure of a person. And once you've begun that Terry stop, all that the officer has to do is diligently and reasonably investigate the situation to either confirm his suspicion or dispel his suspicion. If he confirms his suspicion, that might rise to a level of probable cause. If he dispels his suspicion, right, he's got to let that person go, right? He no longer has a reasonable suspicion. He can't detain this person any longer. The seizure must end when his reasonable suspicion is gone, right? So again, remember, on our spectrum of certainty that criminal activity might be afoot, we have 0%. We have this idea of a hunch. 0% to a hunch, police officer can't do anything. If he has a reasonable suspicion, he can stop and investigate. Now, if it rises all the way to probable cause, and remember, this isn't 100% certainty, but it's more than a reasonable suspicion, then he can actually arrest that person. If he has probable cause to believe that some sort of criminal activity has taken place or is about to take place or is in progress, whatever it is, then he can actually arrest that individual, take them into custody, book them, interrogate them, get them ready for a criminal prosecution, right? And obviously a Terry stop can evolve into an arrest. If a reasonable suspicion, as that police officer is investigating the situation further, if he discovers more and more evidence that leads to probable cause, then he can actually arrest that person and take them into custody. Imagine, for instance, a police officer he's driving in his squad car, and he sees somebody driving in front of him who's swerving a little bit in the lane, right? Very slightly, but a little bit more than a reasonable driver would. There's a little bit of swerving going on. So he gets a reasonable suspicion, right, that there might be some sort of criminal activity. Hey, this person might be intoxicated in front of me. They're swerving a little bit. So he's allowed to investigate, right? He can perform a Terry stop and investigate to either confirm or dispel his suspicion. So, of course, he stops the car. He goes over. What happens? The guy rolls down his window. He can immediately smell alcohol. He asks the guy to get out of the car. The guy is stumbling, slurring his words. All of these facts, pieces of evidence coming together is eventually going to lead to probable cause. And now this police officer can arrest this suspect, right? Book him, take him into custody. So what we're really looking for, though, to have probable cause, it's a pretty high threshold. Normally the police officer either has to personally witness the crime taking place, or a credible witness is telling the police officer that this crime has just taken place. Those are the main two things we want to see for probable cause. But again, it's a totality of the circumstances analysis, right? If in the example I just described, right? You smell the alcohol, guy's slurring his words, he can barely stand up, right? You know, you're asking him questions, he can't answer the questions. At some point, that's going to turn into probable cause and you can arrest him. Another key thing to realize too is during a Terry stop, a police officer can ask you to identify yourself. If a police officer asks somebody to identify themselves, tell him his name, and that person refuses, that can lead to an arrest. If you refuse to tell a police officer to identify yourself to a police officer, that can automatically become an arrest. You can be taken into custody, okay? Just one nuance there. So this, though, is the main thing that we want to remember here. This is all that you have to do under a Fourth Amendment analysis. There's only one other little caveat that I have up here on the board, and that's going to be in some situations, usually to arrest somebody, a law enforcement officer does not need an arrest warrant. All he needs is probable cause. But if you are going to arrest somebody who is in their home, then you need a warrant, right? So I just have this written right here is if the law enforcement officer has probable cause, before he can make the arrest, you want to ask yourself on a criminal procedure essay, is there a warrant requirement? The only time there would be a warrant requirement is if the police officer was making that arrest in a person's home, right? If that person, that suspect is in their own home, that police officer needs a warrant to arrest someone in their home. But if he waits for that person to come out of the home, right, he can then, if he has probable cause, arrest them when they get out on the street, right? No warrant is needed when you have probable cause unless that suspect is actually in his home. But that sums it up, guys. This is how easy a Fourth Amendment seizure of a person analysis is. Remember, all you do, number one, you have to ask yourself, did the government seize a person? Two big points to make here. We have to have the government, so you're looking for a law enforcement officer, seizing a person, right? A human being. If we have a government official, a police officer, searching or seizing evidence, that's a different analysis, and that's what we're going to talk about in our next video. What we're talking about right here is when the government is seizing a person. If so, all you do is identify, is this a Terry stop or is this an arrest? If it's a Terry stop, remember they have to have a reasonable suspicion to conduct that Terry stop. To make an arrest, you need more than just a reasonable suspicion. You need probable cause, okay? And if you have probable cause, that's usually going to be a lawful arrest unless there is that warrant requirement if the suspect is in their home. But that's it, guys. That's all we need to know right now for the Fourth Amendment seizure committed by the government to a person. With that, though, I'll leave you all to it, and I'll see you at our next video.